Hi everyone, welcome to GoLocal Live and happy Tuesday afternoon. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for the 4 o'clock News and Politics show. If you missed it at 3 o'clock, former NHL star Brian Berard broke down Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final, looking ahead to Game 2. But we're going to look down to the University of Virginia, as we usually do most Tuesdays, with Professor of Political Science Jennifer Lawless. Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Of course.
You just came off a pretty heady week down at the Miller Center in Charlottesville at UVA for Prez Fest, featuring former President Bill Clinton and more. Quoted in the national press about your views on women in politics and the glass ceiling. Talk with us a little bit. You said Prez Fest was crazy. For folks who don't know what Prez Fest is, can you please explain?
Sure. So this was the first annual Presidential Ideas Festival held at the University of Virginia and sponsored by the Miller Center. And the whole idea was to engage academics, practitioners, policy wonks who have worked in previous presidential administrations so that we can gain a better handle on important policy questions, but also the politics that sort of guide what gets done, or more relevant, what doesn't get done in Washington, D.C. And so there were people from the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, tons of journalists, and a few political scientists as well, sort of shedding light on what we see some of the biggest challenges to be, and what the implications are for democracy more broadly. So it was a crazy few days with some really, really impressive people.
And you had some comments about women in politics, obviously, as we see a crowded 2020 Democratic presidential field. You had some things to say about women in politics and how, again, it's not cookie cutter.
I think symbolically, it's really important to recognize that we have more women running for president now than we ever have before. In every presidential election cycle dating back to 2000, we've had a female candidate. But we haven't had, with the exception of Hillary Clinton, anybody ever garner the nomination. And we certainly haven't had multiple women polling, as well as a lot of multiple men running right now. So it's clear that at least one and probably two of these women that have already announced will make it into the top tier of the set of candidates, and we'll be talking about them moving forward. More practically speaking, though, the reality is that none of these women have the name recognition or the background that the two frontrunners, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, have, and in a lot of ways have earned. Joe Biden was vice president. Bernie Sanders was the runner-up for the nomination. And so it's important when we think about the kinds of coverage that they're getting and the way that they're being received by voters to keep in mind that there are lots of different factors at play, and we shouldn't automatically assume that they're not being treated well or they're being treated differently because they're women.
Let's talk a little bit about Joe Biden. As expected, has come under fire, of course, for his position on the 1994 crime bill. We saw more heated comments throughout the weekend from both the president and opponent Bernie Sanders. We knew this was coming. How much is it going to be a factor?
In the Democratic primary, it can hurt, but I'd like to lay out a few things. The first is that it was a different time, and I feel like I find myself saying that a lot. But legislation that was popular and that moved through and that solved a problem in 1994 is not going to look the same as legislation that might move through and solve a problem, even the same problem, today. Norms have changed, technology has changed, the way the American people think about key important issues have changed. And so this was a bipartisan bill that Bill Clinton signed that was meant to reduce crime that had been at its highest rate in decades. Now, there were a lot of unintended and unforeseen consequences, and a lot of those had to do with the racialized nature of the criminal justice system, the way that mandatory minimums went awry, and there's no question that Democrats recognize that those kinds of things need to be corrected. But signing that bill in 1994 does not mean, and supporting it in 1994, does not mean signing and supporting that bill in 2019. And I think it's important for voters to realize that the context has changed, and any bill that you sign and any bill that you support has unintended consequences, and that's why you come back and you revisit these things later. I'd also like to note that the idea that Donald Trump is bashing Joe Biden for supporting this is laughable when he's actually taken out full-page ads in major newspapers calling for the death penalty for people who actually were exonerated from committing crimes. So, the messenger matters a little bit too.
Let's talk a little bit about some politics that have been dominating local and national news, and that's states addressing the issue of reproductive rights. And just today, finding out that the Supreme Court will not be reviewing Indiana's abortion law signed by now current Vice President Pence.
Right. So the Supreme Court has punted and has basically said, with the exception of Clarence Thomas, who seems pretty eager to revisit this issue, that they're not taking this up right now. They're not saying that they're not going to take it up in the next term. They're not saying that they're not going to take it up in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. But right now, these are not going to be the cases that they embrace. And so for reproductive rights supporters, in some ways, that's good news because it means that overturning Roe versus Wade is not imminent. But the downside is that they've basically let stand a lot of pretty draconian restrictions, this having to do with the disposal of fetal tissue, that certainly are antithetical to what the pro-choice side of the issue supports. So, and the Supreme Court has also made it clear that as the rest of these states continue to implement what amount to abortion bans, they're not that eager to weigh in, which means that we really are getting to a point where all of the decisions are going to be made by the states.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Of course, we've just seen several states addressing the issue now. We see a battle playing out here in Rhode Island as well. What do we expect to see across the country moving forward at the state level? And then we'll talk a little bit about what a potential different makeup of the Supreme Court could mean for an appetite to look at some of these cases.
Well, I think we can expect a few different things. The first is it's making it very, very difficult for abortion providers to provide their services, even if Roe versus Wade remains intact. And Missouri, for example, is on its way to losing the last abortion provider because the State Department of Health is just not going to renew that license. So even within the framework of Roe versus Wade, states can all but outlaw abortion by making it impossible for a woman to get one. The second thing is what we've seen and heard various states passing in the last few weeks will likely trickle over to a lot of other states. And states that have anti-choice legislatures or anti-choice governors have basically encountered a political environment that's pretty amenable to passing legislation that would probably have been deemed unconstitutional and no one would have tried to enforce 2 or 4 or 10 years ago. The final thing that I would note here is that the Democratic presidential candidates are getting pretty specific about how they're going to counter this chipping away at a woman's right to choose. And these questions bear directly on federalism more broadly, with Kamala Harris saying that if you're a state that already has a bad reputation in terms of protecting women's rights and upholding Roe versus Wade, she wants anything that you do regarding abortion to have to pass through the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Conservatives don't like big government. Conservatives don't like abortion. And this is one more way that I think the parties are going to be divided.
Speaking of conservatives, the latest today in what was probably anticipated, another run by Roy Moore.
It's unbelievable. I think that what we've seen in the last 4 years is that the Republican Party and people who subscribe to the Republican Party are willing to make exceptions for anybody that can win a race. They were willing to support Roy Moore right up until the end, and they're not necessarily demanding that he get out of the race right now. In a lot of ways, this is the best news possible for Doug Jones. If there is a different nominee, it's hard to imagine a scenario whereby a moderate Democrat keeps his seat in Alabama. But I think it does speak to these broader issues and the way that the Republican Party seems to have lost its way and any sort of moral compass.
And what are we going to keep an eye on in the coming week now that we are entering the summer season and again 2020 is in full swing? What are you going to be watching?
I really think that we're getting to the point right now where Donald Trump is weighing in on the Democratic primary in a way that is in some ways even shaping what the Democratic primary looks like. So I'm going to continue to look at his statements, what he said about Joe Biden, the way that he's using the office of the presidency to weigh in on the next presidential election is somewhat unprecedented. And so, I think that that's basically what we'll see over the course of the summer. We should also obviously be looking at what else Congress manages not to be able to do. 2 Republicans have now ensured that it's not going to be until Congress comes back from recess that they're able to pass what should have been sort of a unanimous bipartisan disaster relief package. So I think it's basically going to be a lot more of the same, which unfortunately is nothing.
Well, we'll check in with you hopefully next week to get the latest. As we know, a week can be an eternity in politics. But again, catching up on the heels of PresFest at UVA, I want to Congratulate you for the first one down there. And more, and again, looking forward to talking next week. Jennifer Lawless down at UVA. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, don't go anywhere. We're going to get a lot more local here with a local housing issue in Johnston, as GoLocal originally broke last September, with tenants being exposed to issues of mold and falling ceilings at the Park Plaza Apartments in Johnston. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back.